My name is Pamela Peterson, and what I'm about to share with you changed not only my life but my entire understanding of reality. I never imagined I would be chosen to witness what happens in the final 7 days before Christ's return, but God's plans are far beyond our understanding. It was a quiet Thursday evening in September at my farmhouse just outside of Kalispell, Montana. The kind of evening where everything feels ordinary until it suddenly isn't. I'd just returned home from my shift at the Flathead County Library, where I'd worked as the head librarian for the past 15 years. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything looked from my kitchen window. I was preparing a simple dinner, salmon with roasted vegetables, something I'd made countless times before. My husband Tom was away at a construction site in Missoula, and my 2 grown children were living their own lives in different states. The house was quiet except for the gentle humming of my old refrigerator and the sound of my border collie, Max, snoring softly in his favorite spot near the back door. The first bite of salmon tasted normal, but within minutes, my throat began to feel strange. I'd never had food allergies before, so at first, I didn't understand what was happening. The sensation quickly progressed from uncomfortable to terrifying. My throat was closing up, and panic set in as I realized I couldn't breathe. I tried to reach for my phone on the counter, but my movements were becoming uncoordinated. The last thing I remember was Max barking frantically and my knees buckling beneath me as the kitchen floor rushed up to meet me. Later, I learned that my neighbor, Sarah, had felt led by the Spirit to bring over some fresh eggs, something she'd never done before. She found me unconscious on the kitchen floor and called 911. The doctors told me I had developed a sudden adult-onset seafood allergy, something that apparently can happen even if you've eaten fish your whole life. I was clinically dead for 9 minutes and 17 seconds before they were able to revive me. But those 9 minutes and 17 seconds? They felt like an eternity, and what I experienced during that time was more real than anything I've ever known in this physical world. The transition from my kitchen floor to somewhere else was instantaneous. One moment I was struggling to breathe, and the next, I was enveloped in what I can only describe as living light. It wasn't bright in a way that hurt your eyes, it was bright in a way that showed you things clearly for the first time. Colors I had never seen before, dimensions I hadn't known existed, all of it washing over me like waves of pure understanding. I found myself in what appeared to be a garden, but calling it merely a garden feels like calling the ocean merely water. Every flower, every leaf, every blade of grass was alive with purpose and consciousness. The air itself felt thick with love and wisdom. As I stood there, trying to comprehend my surroundings, I became aware of a presence behind me, a presence so powerful yet so gentle that my soul recognized it before I even turned around. When I did turn, I saw him. Jesus. Not as the paintings show him, not as I had imagined him, but as he truly is. His eyes held the depth of all creation, yet when he looked at me, I felt personally known and completely loved. His presence was overwhelming yet comforting, majestic yet intimate. I fell to my knees, not out of fear or obligation, but because my soul couldn't respond any other way to such perfect love. Pamela, he said, and his voice resonated through every part of my being. It was like hearing your name spoken for the first time in its truest form. I have brought you here because time grows short, and my people need to understand what is coming. As he spoke, the garden around us began to shift and change. The space opened up into what I can only describe as a vast amphitheater of light, with what looked like countless windows or portals showing different aspects of Earth, past, present, and what was yet to come. You will witness the final 7 days before my return, he continued, not to bring fear, but to bring understanding and hope. What I show you must be shared, for in these final days, many will need to choose their path with clear eyes and open hearts. I felt a deep sense of unworthiness wash over me. Lord, I whispered, I'm just a librarian from Montana. Why me? How can I possibly share something so important? His smile held such tenderness that it brought tears to my eyes. My precious child, he replied, I have always used the humble to confound the wise. Your love for stories, your heart for truth, and your spirit of discernment, these were not accidents. I have prepared you for this moment since before you were born. The air around us began to shimmer with anticipation, and I could feel that we were about to begin this incredible journey through the final 7 days. But before the vision started, Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt strength and courage flow through me like a river. Watch carefully, he said, for what you are about to see will shake the foundations of the earth, yet bring hope to those who truly know me. These 7 days will be unlike any other time in human history. What Jesus showed me next shook me to my very core, and I pray I can convey it with the gravity and urgency it deserves. Day 7 began with an image of the world's communication systems suddenly and inexplicably failing. I watched as cell phones went dark, internet connections dropped, and satellite systems malfunctioned worldwide. But this wasn't like any normal technology failure, there was something deeply spiritual about it. Watch, Jesus said, his voice filled with both authority and compassion, as the noise of the world falls silent, making way for my voice to be heard. I saw people everywhere experiencing the same thing simultaneously, a forced disconnection from the digital world that had consumed so much of their attention. At first, there was panic. I watched as people in cities and towns across the globe frantically tried to restore their connections, to regain access to their digital lives. But as the silence persisted, something remarkable began to happen. In the absence of the constant digital chatter, people began to look up. That's when the lights appeared. These weren't like any aurora borealis or natural phenomenon I'd ever seen. The entire sky, from pole to pole, began to pulse with colors that defied description, colors that seemed to speak directly to the human soul. These lights weren't just visible, they carried a message that resonated in the depths of every human heart. These signs, Jesus explained, will be my final call to those who have been too distracted to hear my voice. Even the most hardened skeptic will feel their soul stirring in response. I watched as people of all nations, tribes, and tongues stood transfixed by the celestial display. Scientists attempted to explain it through natural means, but their instruments could detect nothing conventional about these lights. They defied all known laws of physics and astronomy. But what happened next was even more extraordinary. As people stood watching the lights, a mass spiritual awakening began to unfold. It was as if scales fell from people's eyes all at once. I saw hardened atheists falling to their knees in recognition of a higher power. Lifelong agnostics suddenly understood with perfect clarity that there was more to existence than the material world. This is the beginning of the final harvest, Jesus said. In these 7 days, more souls will turn to me than in the previous century combined. As day 6 dawned in my vision, I witnessed something that seemed paradoxical, a supernatural peace descending on believers even as spiritual warfare became visible to human eyes. It was as if the veil between the physical and spiritual realms had grown tissue paper thin. Jesus gestured toward a scene unfolding before us. On this day, my people will experience a peace that transcends all understanding, even as they see the battle that has always raged around them. I watched in awe as believers worldwide were suddenly enveloped in a visible light of peace. It was like a protective cocoon of God's presence, shimmering around them with a gentle, golden glow. But at the same time, they could now see what had always been invisible, the spiritual warfare taking place in the heavenly realms. I saw angels, massive and powerful, engaged in battle with dark forces. These weren't the cute cherubs of popular art, these were mighty warriors of light, and the sight of them was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The spiritual battles that had always been fought unseen were now visible to human eyes, and it changed everything about how people understood their world. My children will finally understand why I taught them to put on the full armor of God, Jesus explained. They will see that their prayers were not just words spoken into the air, but powerful weapons in an ongoing battle. But what touched me most deeply was watching what happened with the children and elderly. They began experiencing profound prophetic dreams and visions. I saw young children waking up with tears of joy, speaking of conversations with angels. Elderly people in nursing homes, even those with dementia, suddenly gained perfect clarity and began prophesying with remarkable accuracy. The young and the old will dream dreams and see visions, Jesus said, echoing the ancient prophecy of Joel. Those the world often overlooks will become my most powerful messengers in these final days. I watched as a young girl, no more than 7 years old, stood in front of her classroom and spoke with wisdom that left her teachers speechless. An elderly man in a wheelchair, who hadn't spoken clearly in years, suddenly began sharing detailed visions of God's love and coming judgment with his caregivers. The atmosphere itself seemed to be charged with supernatural energy. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more clear, as if all of creation was awakening to its original purpose. Plants seemed to grow more vibrantly, and animals began behaving differently, more peacefully, more purposefully. Nature itself, Jesus explained, knows that creation's redemption draws near. Even the rocks are preparing to cry out in praise. But what struck me most about this day was the stark contrast between those who embraced what was happening and those who refused to see it. While believers were experiencing supernatural peace and clarity, those who hardened their hearts against these signs became increasingly agitated and confused. It was as if humanity was being gently but firmly pressed to make a final choice, to embrace the truth or to reject it completely. In these days, Jesus said, his voice filled with both love and sorrow, every soul will be brought to a point of decision. The truth will be undeniable, but the choice to accept or reject it will remain their own. As this vision of day 6 began to fade, I felt my heart breaking for those who were choosing to turn away, even in the face of such clear evidence of God's reality. Jesus, sensing my sadness, turned to me with eyes full of compassion. "Remember, Pamela," he said gently, "that even in these final days, my mercy remains. Each person's choice must be their own, but my arms remain open until the very end." The vision began to shift again, and I knew we were about to witness what would happen on day 5. The weight of what I had already seen was almost overwhelming, but I felt strengthened by his presence, knowing that each detail was crucial for those who would hear this testimony. As day 5 began to unfold before my eyes, I witnessed something that made my heart race, the beginning of a global economic collapse unlike anything in history. But this wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a divine unveiling of humanity's misplaced trust. "Watch," Jesus said, his voice both firm and tender, as the systems that people have put their faith in begin to crumble. I saw stock markets worldwide plummet simultaneously. Digital banking systems began failing, not due to cyber attacks or technical glitches, but because of something far more profound, a supernatural revealing of their fragility. Money itself seemed to lose its meaning as people suddenly realized how they had made wealth their idol. But what amazed me was the stark contrast between two groups of people. Those who had built their lives on material security were in complete panic, while believers experienced something extraordinary, supernatural provision that defied natural laws. I watched as communities of believers began experiencing multiplication of resources, reminiscent of the feeding of the 5,000. Food, fuel, and necessities were somehow always enough, even when it seemed impossible. It wasn't abundance in the way the world defines it, but rather a perfect provision that showed God's faithfulness. "My children," Jesus explained, "will experience my protection and provision in ways that will remind the world of the Israelites in Goshen during the plagues of Egypt." Then something even more remarkable began to happen. Nature itself started responding to the spiritual reality of these final days. I saw gardens producing food at impossible rates. Wild animals began acting differently around believers, even predatory creatures became peaceful in their presence. It was as if creation itself was aligning with its original purpose before the fall. Creation groans for redemption, Jesus said, and in these final days, it begins to remember its true nature. But what struck me most powerfully about Day 5 was witnessing how God's protection manifested over His people. It wasn't just physical protection, though that was part of it. I saw what looked like domes of light surrounding believers and their communities. These weren't visible to the natural eye but were absolutely real in the spiritual realm. Within these domes, peace reigned even as chaos increased outside. This protection, Jesus emphasized, isn't just physical security. It's the fulfillment of my promise that my peace will guard their hearts and minds in me. As Day 4 dawned in the vision, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The air itself seemed to become charged with healing power. What I witnessed next was both beautiful and overwhelming, a wave of supernatural healing sweeping across the globe. On this day, Jesus said, "I will pour out my healing power as a testimony to my mercy, even at this late hour." I watched in awe as people with terminal illnesses were suddenly made well. Cancer vanished. Chronic conditions disappeared. But it wasn't happening in huge stadium events or healing services, it was happening everywhere, spontaneously, as God's power flowed like a river across the earth. In hospitals worldwide, doctors stood amazed as patients were healed before their eyes. Medical equipment registered the impossible, tumors disappearing, organs regenerating, injuries healing in moments. But what made this even more remarkable was that it wasn't limited to believers. God's healing power was touching everyone who would receive it. This healing, Jesus explained, is not just for bodies, but for souls. It's a final demonstration of my love before the end. Then, something even more extraordinary occurred. Angels became visible to many people. Not just believers, but anyone whose heart was open to seeing. These weren't the cherubic figures of popular art, they were magnificent beings of light and purpose. Some were warrior angels, standing guard over cities and nations. Others were ministering angels, bringing comfort and guidance to those in need. My heavenly hosts, Jesus said, will no longer be hidden from those who have eyes to see. They have always been present, but now their reality will be undeniable. But with this incredible outpouring of the supernatural, the great deception also reached its peak. I watched as false teachers and deceived leaders tried to explain away these miracles through New Age philosophies and human reasoning. They attributed the healings to evolved human consciousness or universal energy, anything but acknowledging the true source. The deception, Jesus said with sadness in his voice, will be so convincing that it could deceive even the elect, if that were possible. But those who truly know me will recognize my voice. I saw people having to make immediate choices about how to interpret what they were witnessing. Some fell to their knees in humble recognition of God's power, while others hardened their hearts, choosing to believe the elaborate explanations that denied God's hand in these events. The most heartbreaking part was watching those who had claimed to be religious leaders leading people astray. They used scripture out of context and twisted spiritual truths to support their denials of what God was clearly doing. Not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," Jesus reminded me, his voice heavy with sorrow, truly knows me. In these days, the truth of each heart will be revealed. As Day 4 continued, I noticed something else. Time itself seemed to be behaving differently. Minutes and hours didn't flow quite the way they usually did. It was as if creation itself was holding its breath, knowing that the culmination of all things was approaching. Time is my creation, Jesus explained, and as the end draws near, even it begins to respond to my coming. The vision of Day 4 began to fade, and I could feel the weight of what was still to come. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with love and urgency. "There is more you must see," he said, "for the final 3 days will bring even greater wonders and choices." I steadied myself, knowing that what was coming would be even more intense than what I had already witnessed. The air around us began to shift again, preparing to reveal what would happen on Day 3. As day 3 unfolded before my eyes, I witnessed something that can only be described as the beginning of the final harvest of souls. The spiritual atmosphere had changed so dramatically that it felt like the air itself was alive with God's presence. "Watch now," Jesus said, his voice resonating with both authority and tender love, "as my spirit moves in the final gathering of my children." I saw a wave of supernatural wisdom and discernment sweep across believers worldwide. It was as if scales fell from their eyes, and they could suddenly understand Scripture with perfect clarity. Verses they had read hundreds of times before revealed deeper meanings. Prophecies that had seemed mysterious became crystal clear. The weather patterns across the globe began changing in ways that defied scientific explanation. I saw storm systems forming perfect crosses in the sky. Clouds moved against the wind, forming words from Scripture in multiple languages simultaneously. The sun and moon began to behave strangely, not in a frightening way, but in a manner that clearly demonstrated God's control over all creation. "Even the elements," Jesus explained, "will testify to my sovereignty in these final days." But what struck me most about day 3 was watching ordinary believers minister with extraordinary power. People who had never preached before found themselves speaking with wisdom that left scholars amazed. The youngest believers were sharing insights that confounded the oldest theologians. It wasn't human wisdom or learning, it was purely supernatural. "In these hours," Jesus said, "I will pour out my Spirit without measure on those who truly know me." As day 2 began, I felt a shift in the spiritual atmosphere that was almost tangible. Time itself seemed to move differently, as if each moment was more weighted with purpose than the last. The separation between true believers and those who merely practice religion became startlingly clear. I watched as churches that had appeared successful by worldly standards suddenly stood empty, while small gatherings of genuine believers overflowed with God's presence. It wasn't about numbers anymore, it was about authentic relationship with Jesus. "This is the separation of wheat from chaff," Jesus explained. "No one will be able to fake their relationship with me any longer." The unity I witnessed among true believers was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Denominational walls crumbled. Doctrinal differences that had seemed so important before faded away in the light of Christ's imminent return. I saw Catholics embracing Protestants, Pentecostals praying with Presbyterians, Baptists worshiping alongside Orthodox believers, all previous divisions forgotten in the reality of Christ's presence. "This unity," Jesus said, his voice filled with joy, "is what I've always desired for my church." Not uniformity, but true unity in spirit and truth. But perhaps most remarkable was how time itself seemed to be compressed. Hours felt like minutes, yet each moment was so full of God's presence that it felt like eternity. The boundary between the natural and supernatural had grown so thin that believers could almost step between them at will. "Time is drawing to its close," Jesus explained, "and even it must bow to my purpose." As the vision of day 2 began to fade, I felt my heart racing with the anticipation of what was to come. The final day, the day before Christ's return, still waited to be revealed, and I could sense that it would be the most incredible yet. Jesus turned to me, his eyes blazing with love and purpose. "Are you ready," he asked, "to see what happens on the final day?" I nodded, though my spirit trembled at the weight of what was to come. The air around us began to shimmer once again, preparing to show me the last day before his return. The final day unfolded before me with an intensity that made everything before seem pale in comparison. The very atmosphere had changed, it was as if creation itself was holding its breath in anticipation. "This," Jesus said, his voice filling every part of my being, "is the day of final preparation." What I witnessed in these last 24 hours before Christ's return was beyond anything human language can fully capture, but I'll do my best to share it as faithfully as I can. The day began with what looked like waves of light rolling across the earth. These weren't physical lights like the northern lights we'd seen before, these were waves of pure spiritual energy. As each wave passed over an area, people experienced what I can only describe as instant clarity. Every single person on earth, whether they believed in God or not, suddenly understood with perfect clarity their relationship with their Creator. In these final hours, Jesus explained, every soul will know truth. What they do with that knowledge will be their final choice. I watched as this clarity affected people in drastically different ways. Those who had been seeking God fell to their knees in worship, their hearts finally understanding what they'd been searching for all along. Others, who had been running from God, found themselves faced with a decision they could no longer postpone or avoid. The most remarkable thing was how time itself seemed to flow differently. Moments stretched into what felt like hours when it came to making spiritual decisions, yet the physical world appeared to be moving at an accelerated pace. It was as if God was stretching time itself to give every soul their final chance to choose. Time is my creation, Jesus said, and in these last hours, it serves my purpose of redemption. Then I witnessed something that took my breath away. A moment of complete stillness fell across the entire earth. For a brief period, everything stopped. The wind ceased to blow, the oceans became as smooth as glass, and even the birds hung motionless in the sky. In this stillness, every person on earth heard the same thing, the gentle whisper of God's voice, speaking to each heart in their own language. This, Jesus explained, is my final call of love to every soul I created. As the day progressed, I saw believers worldwide experiencing what I can only describe as a supernatural preparation. Their spiritual eyes were fully opened, and they began moving with perfect purpose and understanding. It wasn't frantic or chaotic, it was a coordinated symphony of God's people moving in complete unity with His Spirit. Then, in the final hours, the atmosphere began to change again. The very air seemed to become charged with the weight of glory. Colors became more vivid, sounds more clear, as if creation itself was being tuned to a higher frequency of existence. Just as this vision of the final day was coming to its close, Jesus turned to me one last time. His eyes held both infinite love and urgent purpose. "Pamela," he said, "what you have witnessed must be shared. These 7 days are not meant to bring fear, but hope and preparation. Tell my people that there is still time, but they must choose now whom they will serve." Suddenly, I felt myself being pulled back. The glorious light began to fade, and I could hear distant voices calling my name. The next thing I knew, I was looking up at the concerned faces of emergency room doctors and nurses. I learned later that my neighbor Sarah had found me just in time. The doctors told me I had experienced complete cardiac arrest from the allergic reaction, and they had been about to call time of death when my heart suddenly started beating again. They called it a medical miracle, but I knew it was much more than that. The weeks following my experience were filled with a deep sense of urgency and purpose. I knew I had been shown these things not just for myself, but for others. Each detail was seared into my memory with supernatural clarity, and I felt compelled to share it with anyone who would listen. But let me be clear, this testimony isn't meant to create fear or panic. It's not about setting dates or making predictions. Instead, it's a message of hope and preparation. The 7 days I witnessed showed me that God's ultimate purpose is redemption, not destruction. His heart is to gather His children, not to condemn the world. What I learned through this experience is that our relationship with Jesus Christ is what matters most. All the signs, wonders, and supernatural events I witnessed were amazing, but they all pointed to one essential truth: the importance of knowing Him personally. To everyone who hears or reads this testimony, I want to emphasize that there's still time, but we must not waste it. These events I've described aren't meant to be a spiritual spectacle or a source of speculation. They're a wake-up call to draw close to Jesus now, to make our relationship with Him real and personal. Don't wait for the spectacular signs. Don't wait for the supernatural manifestations. The time to know Him is now. The time to choose is now. The time to make your relationship with Jesus real and personal is now. I share this testimony with humility and urgency, knowing that I'm just a simple librarian from Montana who was given an extraordinary glimpse of what's to come. My prayer is that everyone who hears this account will understand that God's heart in showing these things is love, pure, perfect, pursuing love for every single person on earth. The choice remains ours, but the time to make it grows shorter with each passing day. May we all choose wisely, and may we all be ready when that final week begins. As I conclude this testimony, I'm reminded of Jesus' final words to me before I returned: tell them I love them. Tell them I'm coming. Tell them to be ready. And that, more than anything else, is the heart of everything I've shared.